Chapter 69. When I woke, I found myself tied to a chair inside the main hallway of the manor. At first, I was groggy and didn't understand what was going on, but as I came to my senses, the horror of what had just happened took over me. The relief that we were still in the storyline, that we were still alive, was little solace. We were still at the very beginning of the party phase. This was just the setup for the story. That would explain why Cursed had such high plot armor. He needed enough moxie to ensure he could lure us in. I looked around at the others. They were tied to chairs the same as me, and the thick ropes used to bind us did not look like the kind you could cut through quickly, and certainly not the kind you could muscle your way out of without a lot of metal. Heck, this whole event might have been scripted so tightly that it couldn't be avoided, but I wasn't sure. I couldn't see the script, and our only ally with access to it had not made her appearance yet. Kimberly was panicking, or pretending to panic. I couldn't tell which. Aunt One and Michael were trying to break the ropes with pure strength, to no avail. Hawk Kipling was awake but kept his cool. Andrew was trying to reach the knot in the ropes behind him, but he had no success. I wished that I had brought my escape artist trop, but I suspected that it wouldn't matter just yet. We were off-screen. I doubted any of us were getting out of our bindings unless the audience saw it. So, I relaxed. "This looks scripted," I said. "I don't know what's going to happen, but keep your wits." "How do you know this isn't a game over?" Ant-Man asked. I didn't, but if it was, there was no use in panicking just yet. In my experience, emotions like that had a way of gaining momentum, so it was best to delay them as long as you could. It wasn't much longer after I woke up that our host, Egan Cursed, entered the room. On screen. We screamed at him and yelled to be let go, and all of it was useless, but we had to say something. He ignored us as he went into his monologue. "I suspect you're wondering why it is that I called you here, although you were probably more specifically worried about why it is that I gassed you and tied you up. So, I'll make you a promise, from this point forward, I will not lie to you. Of course, I don't expect you to believe me, but it is true. I need you to know the facts so that I can best utilize your skill sets." He walked toward us slowly, with no trace of anger on his face despite what he had done to us. He was almost friendly, but reserved. "A month ago, if you had told me that werewolves existed, I would have laughed in your face. Oh, how jealous I am of my past ignorance. I digress. As a man of means, I've been able to give those I love everything they have ever asked for. And last month, my son asked to take a trip here to Carousel for a camping experience that he said would be like no other. It had a brochure and everything. I would never deny him his happiness. After all, one day, he's going to need something to think back to when he's sitting behind a desk making adult decisions, wouldn't you say?" He paused as if we were going to respond in kind. None of us responded. Perhaps we should have, but the truth was, even though all of this was a show, there definitely was an aura of fear in the room because none of us knew what to expect, and we desperately wanted there to be good news somewhere buried inside his exposition. Well, it would seem that on that camping trip, my son and his friends were attacked by creatures that could not exist, werewolves. If I had not seen him transform after acquiring the curse, I would never believe it, but I have seen it. In the ensuing weeks, I have gone from someone who did not believe in werewolves to someone who knows everything there is to know, except for how to catch one. No, it would seem that such knowledge is passed down from hunter to hunter and is written about rarely in the texts I was able to acquire. For much of human history, the idea of purposefully going out and finding werewolves would have been seen as folly. But here you are, hunters of the howling shadows, defying all logic and common sense. I believe that you have the abilities and knowledge required to help me. So hire us, Hawk said. Cut it out with all the theatrics. Give us money, and we will do the thing we do for a living. Why are you overcomplicating it? Cursed walked around us in slow circles, occasionally weaving in between us to examine our faces. I know the nature of men and the nature of tradesmen more so. And I know that no amount of money could ever buy a man's entire heart, his entire mind. At most, you get 50%. The rest is saved because, in truth, the employee always resents his employer, and he will either subconsciously or purposefully withhold his true potential. What are you talking about? Ant-Man asked. Your kid got bit by the curse, and you want us to kill the pack leader. That's what we do for a living. 50%, 100%, it doesn't matter. A dead wolf is a dead wolf. In the heat of the hunt, we will do what it takes to survive. Yes, a dead wolf is a dead wolf. Unless that wolf is twice as large as any other and is able to shift in daylight at will. That comment sucked the air out of the room. I didn't have the complete account of the lore because my character was, in many ways, an outsider, not a true hunter, but someone who had stumbled into the world of the paranormal. From the videos I had watched, I knew enough to know that being able to shift in daylight was a sign of a very seasoned, mature wolf, and that the size of a werewolf was determined by its rank in the pack, not only by the size of its human form. Sounds like you got quite the wolf problem, Hawk said. But all the same, I've killed old wolves and young wolves. Ain't no matter. Just pay me my money and untie me, damn it. It isn't quite that simple, Curse said. I already tried that. Finding a hunter was one of the first things that I did. You see, I don't lack for resources, and it took me almost no time to discover the secret underworld of paranormal investigation. In fact, I had purchased this legendary estate within a week in hopes that it might hold close to the curse. Money gets people talking. Curiosity gets them talking faster. As tight-lipped as you hunters are, you sure like talking when people believe you. I found a gentleman that liked to talk. He had a scar on the right side of his face and said that he could take care of my problem easily. I sent him and 4 of my men into the woods to hunt down and kill whatever pack of wolves was terrorizing Carousel, and that was the last I saw of them. You see, he took one look at our wolf infestation and hightailed it out of the state. I found out about his departure by post. My men were nowhere to be found. A scar on his face? Ant-Man said. You're not talking about Tungun McAdoo, are you? Patrick McAdoo, Curse said curiously. Ant-Man started to laugh, as did Hawk Kipling. Well, there's your problem, Hawk said. Tungun McAdoo is a bottom feeder more concerned with his brand than he is with the hunt. I wouldn't be surprised if he saw more than a few wolves and decided it wasn't worth the trouble. Let me guess, you paid him up front? Egan Curse lost all semblance of amusement or warmth from his face. He didn't like being mocked. I suspected as much when he tucked his tail between his legs, Curse said. I suppose I've learned a lesson about your industry, that when there are fewer than 100 people with a skill set, it can be difficult to find good help. Well, I've learned my lesson and learned it well, which is why I decided that money was not enough. You needed better motivation to give me the 100% that I'm paying for. Ant-Man and Hawk stopped laughing. And I will pay you, Curse said. I am a man of my word, so here is my offer. You kill the leader of the pack who turned my son and his girlfriend into monsters before the setting of the last full moon of the cycle, and I will give each of you $1 million. Do I have your attention now? Mock me all you want, but money always seems to quiet contempt. And as my insurance, he said, reaching into his pocket, withdrawing 6 small capsules, and showing them to us. A close inspection revealed that they were syringes. They almost appeared designed to go on the end of a dart for a dart gun, but they had not been fully assembled. They were filled with a liquid that wasn't quite clear, almost like bleach. No, Hawk said. What do you think you're doing with that? Is that what I think it is? Ant-Man asked. Oh yes, Curse said. The werewolf curse spreads by saliva in the bloodstream. In fact, the only part of the werewolf that doesn't revert to human is their saliva. The way I see it, this will ensure your full participation. What is it they say? That you don't truly care unless you have skin in the game? And you do. Or at least, you will soon. No. Ant-Man screamed. I'll do anything, just not that. Please, I'll kill that thing. Don't stick me with that needle, please, no. At the sound of his screams, 5 decked-out commandos came from the same direction that Curse had. They each got behind one of us as we were strapped to our chairs and held us down as we tried to squirm free. These commandos were no joke. Like Cursed, They were NPCs with high plot armor, 25 apiece. This was going to be a high-octane story if the side characters were going to be that strong. Hawk was the first to get injected. He fought as hard as he could, but at the end of the day, there was just nothing we could do. These commandos must have been all metal. They certainly didn't need savvy or moxie, and I half expected that their grit would be low so that they could act as meat shields or cannon fodder. All 25 of those stat points were put into making them strong enough to hold us down, no matter what we did. A simple injection in the arm was all it took. First Hawk, then Kimberly, who screamed and cried and put on a good show, though for what might have been the first time, she was shown up by Antoine. He desperately did not want to get that injection, and it made a lot of sense for his character. His own brother had been turned into a werewolf. He fought as best he could, but at the end of the day, there was nothing to be done. "Don't you come near me with that thing," he screamed. "You think you can just do this to a person and we're going to forgive you because of money or because we feel sorry for you, your poor son? Money, no money, infection, no infection, you're on my list." Curse didn't seem angry at that comment. He must have anticipated it or even respected it. "If those be the consequences," he said, "then I'll take them. If you were a father, you would understand." He injected Antoine, and that was that. Antoine continued to scream, but there was nothing to be done. His rage meant nothing. Michael was stoic as he was infected. So, I had to decide. Did I get emotional like Antoine or Kimberly, or did I look cursed dead in the eye like a man? I chose a bit of both, but it wasn't because I was afraid of the werewolf curse. I just had a thing with needles after being experimented on during the tutorial. I closed my eyes and let it happen. After he was done, Curse took a few steps back and said, "Now, I have your loyalty until the job is done. As I'm sure you're aware, werewolf saliva is not potent. Most who are bitten will never change. They simply die of the injuries from their mauling. The odds are about 1 in 4, but you'll never know whether you have succumbed to the curse until the final full moon of the cycle. So until that happens, I expect nothing but 100% of your efforts in tracking down and killing this beast. In the meantime, I will supply you with unlimited resources, hundreds of pounds of silver that can be molded into any sort of weapon you think might be useful, wolf's bane by the bushel, guns, and several dozen highly trained mercenaries at your command. We have a week and some change. If we succeed in killing the pack leader, you will get the agreed upon sum, and you will have every opportunity to murder me if that's what you wish. But all I ask is that until we have the job done, we work together. You need me as much as I need you. The forest is crowded with wolves." He turned to his commandos and said, "Untie them. We have work to do." And so, each of the commandos undid the ropes that bound us. Antoine put on a show of mean mugging Cursed but didn't attack him because the man was right, we didn't need him. "Now, follow me. I'd like you to meet my son," Curse said. Chapter 70. I don't know why he brought me, I said as we walked down the stairs into the basement. The only thing I can shoot those wolves with is my camera. It may have been the wrong time for a joke, but I wanted to establish that my character was not prone to becoming emotional or losing his cool. That was an important part of setting up Oblivious Bystander, among other things. Like everything else, the stairs in the basement were lit with lanterns, and as we went down, I started to smell the people we were about to meet. They smelled like wet dog. Before long, we followed the corridor to a large clearing that appeared to have been hollowed out of pure rock, more like a cave system than a basement. In the center of that clearing were 2 cages of thick iron bars, about the size of jail cells. 2 people, a man and a woman wearing hospital scrubs with claw marks cut through them, were in those cages. When they looked over at us, they were shocked to see us, or, to be more exact, they were shocked to see Andrew and Michael. Something I hadn't anticipated had happened. As I looked at them on the red wallpaper, I noticed that the tall blonde man and the short, red-headed woman were Logan and Avery, not NPCs acting as surrogates, but the actual players. Their plot armor was set to 0, and they had no tropes equipped, but it definitely appeared to be them. Logan was probably in his late 20s or early 30s. Even in his pitiful state, he had knowing, clever eyes. Avery might have been my age. She was scared witless. Luckily, they were aware enough of their situation that they didn't break character, given that we were on screen. Perhaps they were being controlled by the script. Either way, I could see immediately that they knew what was happening. They must have been so confused because they weren't aware that rescue tropes existed again. "Logan," Curse said, "here comes the cavalry. The best paranormal investigators and monster hunters money could buy. You've got them in a cage down here?" Hawk said. "I suppose this is where you got the werewolf saliva. I half expected they were out there roaming in the wild." "No, not for long," Curse said. "The first thing Logan did after realizing his affliction was call me." "That's a rare amount of trust," Hawk said. "Most newly turned wolves abandon their lives completely and get killed hunting cows if they don't find their pack soon enough. They are too ashamed or too uninterested in returning." Logan and Avery stood there confused, drained of every ounce of energy. "Of course he wanted to return," I said. "He's a rich kid. He doesn't want to be a vagabond by day, dog by night." Logan looked at me. I could see his eyes blur out as he read about me on the red wallpaper. "He returned because he knows his father loves him," Curse said, "and that I would do anything for him." Curse was really selling it. I didn't like the guy after what he did, but he was very compelling. "How much longer do I have before it's permanent?" Logan asked, straining. "It's hard to remember." "That's okay, son," Curse said. "The werewolf infection has a way of confusing a new host. We'll get you fixed. We have plenty of time. Everything will be okay." He got genuinely emotional. "Must have hit practice." "I couldn't feel it coming," Avery said. "The moon's about to come up, isn't it?" "Yes, dear girl," Curse said. "Don't you fret. We will rid you of this curse." As she mentioned the moon was about to rise, I became hyper-aware that I might be infected. Curse said there was a 1 in 4 chance of being turned, and the infected light on my status bar seemed to reflect that, blinking slowly about every 4 seconds. But that got me thinking, if it was almost nighttime and he had just infected us, shouldn't we be locked in cages, too? And wouldn't it be awfully inconvenient to try to hunt werewolves when you turned into one at night? I didn't want to ask those questions on screen because doing so would have made my character look like an idiot who wasn't experienced. Luckily, Hawk did an explainer a few minutes later on screen that covered all of that. Curse had stepped out. Odds are only one of us is going to transform, and even then, I doubt any of us will start showing signs until the latter part of the week. Fast transformations only happen when you're injured, and the greater the injury, the faster they happen. It's like the werewolf in you has to slowly replace the rest of you. With us, we weren't injured, so the replacement will be slow. Heck, it may be a whole other cycle before we fully transform. I expect Logan and Avery here weren't just pricked with a little needle of werewolf saliva. Logan shook his head. "They ate my heart," he said. "That'll do it. That's why werewolves go for the internal organs. They don't just like the taste. If their victim ends up catching the curse, they might even transform that night. Just a little prick of saliva? I'm not sure how long it'll take us." "What do you think the odds are that there was no saliva in those syringes?" I asked. "We'd never know, not if we get the job done." "I don't think you understand the kind of man we're dealing with," Hawk said. "A man like that isn't going to cut corners. Now, let's stop talking. We don't want to antagonize these two. If my estimate is right, we're about to see the enemy." And his estimate was right. As we stood there, backed against the wall as far away from those cages as we could get, Logan and Avery started screaming in pain. It was strange, they didn't sprout ears or a tail immediately. No, the wind started to blow through the cavern of the basement, and the lanterns around us began to flicker until only the biggest one was still lit. There was no mistaking it, these werewolves were magical. Why else would the wind come to greet them as they transformed? The large lantern flickered, and as it did, the room would grow dark, and we would watch them transform one little burst of light at a time. First, the arms lengthened. I could hear the bones stretching. Then, Their bodies started to grow larger. It was hard for me to tell exactly what was happening as they began to sprout fur in patches sporadically with each flicker of the light. One flicker of the light, and suddenly they had a snout, not quite a full wolf snout. Another flicker, and finally, their heads were completely replaced with those of wolves, and their cries turned to howls. Another flicker and the long-armed wolves stood before us, almost identical, with only the slightest difference in the shade of gray to tell them apart. Logan's fur had a slight lightness, possibly thanks to his blonde hair, whereas Avery's had just a hint of auburn. I expected it would be harder to tell them apart when mixed with other wolves. The only real difference, other than the slight variation in fur shade, was the slight sexual dimorphism. Avery kept whatever curves she had, and Logan's torso was triangular in shape like he'd been hitting the gym his whole life. And then, as they shifted from player to enemy, I could finally see their enemy tropes on the red wallpaper. Thanks to their non-existent plot armor, I could see all of their tropes, which was quite useful. Werewolf. Plot armor, 0. Line of underscores. Tropes. Quick change. Artist. This villain can change into and out of their disguise without being seen or getting caught. Hidden in plain sight. This villain cannot be attacked on screen until it attacks the player or is otherwise identified as hostile. Attacking it will not be effective, nor will it change the story. It will cause the player to go off screen for a time. Stop-motion transformation. This creature transforms in phases, with each phase becoming more monstrous. Each phase occurs out of frame and out of sight. Silver bullet. This monster has a weakness specific to them that renders them dead or vulnerable. Join us. This enemy has some means of increasing its numbers through conversion. Everyone is a suspect. No characters or players will have an alibi for the murders occurring before the finale. Repress and deny. This villain will not remember their evil deeds and will adamantly deny any accusations until confronted with undeniable proof on screen. Fatal attraction. This creature is prone to romantic obsession, displaying an intense and often destructive allure. Otherwise impervious. This creature regenerates from all damage, recovering quickly from any wound that isn't inflicted by its unique mortal weakness. Paranormal hierarchy. This creature's effective plot armor is determined by its rank on the chain of command regardless of base plot armor. Animals are psychic. The villain demonstrates knowledge that it has no logical means to acquire, an instinct to kill or survive. Tidy monster. This villain inexplicably becomes clean and almost free of evidence of their violent acts by the time they are next on screen, making them harder to identify. Patient hunter. This villain avoids attacking the entire group at once until second blood, choosing instead to pick off members one by one. Occasional contagion. This villain's infection is not guaranteed to take hold. Victims remain in suspense until the reveal, which depends on the needs of the story and nothing else. Climactic imperative. This villain can only be defeated at the zenith of a conflict or interaction, requiring a dramatic, pivotal confrontation or clever trap rather than being easily dispatched or overwhelmed with conventional means despite all logic. Carousel's uncertainty principle. This villain's lore and weaknesses only become true once they are discovered, but if they are contradicted on screen before being revealed, the lore shifts and is no longer valid. Shifting protagonist. The role of the protagonist shifts between different characters throughout the story, maintaining suspense and unpredictability until a single main hero is solidified during the finale. The audience will not know who the main character is until the finale. At first glance, it became clear that their tropes weren't just monster tropes. They had several that were usually used for masked killers and slashers. As the Atlas had forewarned, there was going to be a small murder mystery element to these wolves as we tried to guess who killed whom. I wasn't looking forward to that. As soon as we went off screen, and one turned to us and said, 4 days, 11 hours, and 37 minutes. His rescue trop gave him a timer, telling us how long we had to kill the pack leader, save Logan and Avery, and save ourselves. I read their tropes off to my teammates, and we discussed them as we stared at the wolves, which banged against the bars of their cages, hoping for freedom. Hawk just stood there and listened. Could he not speak about meta things? Were the rules for Silas Dearcon's fake tutorial different than the norm, or had Carousel nerfed paragons? We could see elements of the plot ahead of us inside of these tropes, but we could also see how terrifyingly difficult this fight was going to be. While they did have an absolute weakness to silver, their climactic imperative drop would nullify that advantage quite a bit. It also appeared that researching the lore was of huge importance, as whatever additional weaknesses or mystical properties they may have would only be available to us if we found them, probably somewhere in the library that this abandoned old house most certainly had to have. Finally, we got to the last drop of the lot, shifting protagonist. That one was interesting because it almost counteracted Kimberly's celebrity drop to give each of us a turn at being the main character. I wondered if I might be the main character. Hard to imagine that. I supposed it could end up being anyone. Chapter 71 Kimberly Tilda. Before I opened my eyes, all I felt was a pang in my heart. Something deeply, deeply painful was on the horizon. Whether it was something in the future or the past, I didn't know. As my eyes began to focus, all I knew for sure was that this character I was playing was real once. They weren't always. Most of the time, it felt like they existed within the four corners of the script alone, but in this story and some others, I knew there was more to the character. I could never explain it to Antoine or Riley, but sometimes I could just feel it, that this was a person who had lived a life and whose story I was borrowing. I could feel the character I was playing in Stray Dawn, and her story was sad and painful and not over. The others humored me the first few times I brought it up, but, not feeling it themselves, they didn't have much to say. I never really blamed them for that. Bobby was the only person on our team that had felt it, and he mostly just remembered small details like his character's favorite foods or nearby relatives. I felt them under my skin, in my bones, no matter what anyone said. I was Kimberly Madison, the girl with no real problems, just the eye candy. Others at Camp Dyer had reported something similar, and the Atlas talked about it, but it never said anything concrete. So a lot of players just claimed it wasn't real, that it was in my mind, that maybe I was sensing something in the script, or I was being scripted. After all, I had to have some role that made me worthwhile. I wasn't a fighter, and I wasn't a planner. I was a face, a big ball of emotion, and I was beautiful, so I must not know what I was talking about. Gentle nudgings from the script, that was all. I opened my eyes, still groggy. "Ma'am, I asked you if you knew how fast you were going," a voice said with an unnatural slowness, like a memory in a dream. With a jolt, I realized what was happening. I found myself behind the wheel of some kind of convertible. There was no reason to try to figure out what kind, because the brand names in Carousel were knockoffs. To my left, a man stood beside my door, not much older than me. He had a long nose, red hair, and adult acne. And he thought I was attractive. My trop, social awareness, told me that, but so did his eyes. He was smiling, no, smirking. Ever since coming to Carousel, I had met so many NPCs that stared unapologetically. This place had monsters and ghosts and all kinds of dangers, but somehow, it was the NPCs who couldn't get their eyes off of me, who couldn't resist the opportunity to flirt, that sent my skin crawling. The question was this in their script and Carousel was forcing them to make me uncomfortable, or was it in their nature, and that was the reason Carousel picked them to begin with? "I'm sorry, officer, I didn't notice if I was speeding," I said, keeping my tone light and playful. I could play a dumb blonde. "When you rounded the curve, you were going at least 80 miles an hour. I eyeballed it. Do you know how dangerous that is?" The man asked as if he were my father, as if he wasn't admonishing me for breaking the law, but rather felt the need to scold me and teach me a lesson. "You don't think I was going that fast, do you?" I asked, on the verge of tears. "It's just that I'm not used to a car with a big engine like this one." "This tin can does not have a big engine," the man said. He took the bait. He had no name on the red wallpaper, but he looked like a normal NPC to me. Officer Stairs Too Long was the only name I knew for him, And sure enough, not long after that thought passed through my head, that was what appeared on the red wallpaper below his poster: "Officer stares too long. You want to see a big engine? Look behind you." I turned my head and saw his gas-guzzling police cruiser, about twice as long and 1.5 times the width of my little convertible. "Wow," I said. "I bet you could chase down just about anything in that car." "Of course I could," Officer Stares Too Long said. "I know this area like the back of my hand." He smiled at me, and suddenly, whatever desire he had to scold me seemed to fade away. Flattery it was, then. "Have you ever been in a real police chase?" I asked. "Well, I wouldn't really call it a chase. I mean, I catch them so quick, you know," he said, clearly lying. He had done nothing but write parking tickets and yell at people for littering. I was sure of it. "Oh my gosh, I would be so scared to chase somebody down," I said. "It's part of the job," he said. "So, what brings you to Carousel? Are you going to be tubing on the river or—" He paused for a moment as he stared at something in front of me. I followed his gaze and saw a photograph tucked up under the windshield, clearly visible, of a group of people, one of whom was me, posing in front of an old, beautiful Gothic mansion. "So you've been up to Witherhold Manor, huh?" he asked. Apparently, I had. "Yes," I said. "It was really scary." "It's not that scary," he said. "Mostly just old. The wind howls over the busted roof and makes a whistling sound, and people get scared for nothing. We're always chasing teenagers out of that place." He wasn't that far from being a teenager himself. "Well, you must know everything about it, then," I said. "Oh yeah," he said. "I'm from Carousel. I grew up here, and the stories about that place. Mostly just good for tourism. I'm not sure if I believe the stories about the werewolves, but there are definitely some odd things that happen in these hills." "Like what?" I asked, ever eager, smiling innocently. "Hikers go missing every other year, it seems like. Sometimes they disappear forever, other times they turn back up a few months later with no memory of what happened, looking like they've seen a ghost," he said. "Do you think it has something to do with with Witherhold Manor?" he said. "Yeah, that," I said with an embarrassed smile. "That depends on who you ask," he said. "They say the place is guarded by werewolves, or ghosts, or maybe the ghosts of werewolves, I don't know. But they've been coming up with rumors about that place ever since the family that built it died out. You know, in fact, that place just got sold. Some rich fellow came and bought it from the town. It was supposed to be a pretty big deal. He's going to fix it up as a historical location. We're supposed to stay away from it. I don't mind. Let him chase the teenagers out." He was trying so hard to sound cool. "You have more important things to do, right?" I asked. "You know it," he said. "Well, I don't know how fast I was going, but I promise that I will go the speed limit if you just let me go, just this one time," I said. I smiled at him, and he blushed, then said, "I'll let you off with a warning this time, Miss Madison," I said. "Kimberly Madison. Well, Miss Madison, welcome to Carousel, and don't you worry about those werewolves and ghosts. The most dangerous thing here is forgetting to wear your life jacket on the river." He smiled and laughed at his joke, and then I laughed, too. It was funny in a dorky way. Riley would have liked it. Eventually, he walked back to his squad car and left me sitting in my convertible on the side of the road. Witherhold Manor, huh? That entire interaction was off-screen. I hated it when that happened. I hated wasting my charm, not that I had to use a lot. He was a normal NPC, so my moxie versus his. I'd win every time. But sometimes, NPCs were a little more complicated than that. Sometimes, they have their own tropes, and it's not just about having high moxie. You also have to have a good story, play your role well, and hope that whatever trop they have, you'll still come out on top. Officer Stares Too Long was not a complicated NPC. He was just there to help introduce me to the world of the story, a story about werewolves and forests and ghosts from the sound of it. I looked over at the seat next to me and saw my purse on top of a map that showed me where I was supposed to go. I scrounged around the car, looking for clues about who I was. The first thing you were supposed to do in a storyline was figure out more about the character you were playing. And I was playing a survivor. More than that, I was playing a final girl, pretty much. I had a picture of myself in front of the manor that the map said I was driving toward, and I had a newspaper clipping about a tragic accident and the mysterious deaths of high school students, all except for one survivor, Kimberly Madison. I read through it and stared at the pictures of the victims, memorizing their names: John, Thomas, Sarah, Jesslyn, and 2 or 3 others whose names had not yet been revealed, at least at the time the article was written. As I scrounged around for more clues, I found a letter in a beautiful envelope. I opened it and read it. Witherhold Manor, Carousel, October 19, 1982. Dear Ms. Kimberly Madison, I hope this letter reaches you as a spark in the dark, as I understand well the weight of the work you have undertaken. My name is Egan Kirst, known to some in the business world, though I suspect that world is of little interest to someone as committed as yourself. Allow me to be more direct. I am a lifelong admirer of the truth, and I believe our paths are aligned. It was through your interview in Frontier Watch that I first became aware of your strength and dedication. To have survived, then found a way to confront and expose a world that others either ridicule or refuse to see, well, few can claim to have done so with such conviction. You have not only survived but become a beacon, a rare champion for those who are otherwise silenced, not to mention a splendid hunter in your own right. It is with that in mind that I extend an invitation to you, one that I believe carries particular significance. I am hosting a gathering on the evening of October 31st at Witherhold Manor here in Carousel. As you may recall, the manor borders the woods where your life was irrevocably changed. And though the years have passed, the land's stories remain as mysterious, and as potent, as ever. I imagine this invitation may feel like a return of sorts. In truth, it is my hope that together we can delve into the questions left unanswered since that night. The evening promises both good company and invaluable perspective. Several of the invited guests have experience with similar, let's say, matters. But it is your unique insight, your ability to see through the veils and expose the truth, that Witherhold truly awaits. I will be providing a substantial honorarium, $3,500, as well as full arrangements for your travel and stay, though I suspect the mysteries of the manor may provide the richest incentive of all. Should you choose to accept, please respond by way of the courier who delivered this letter. I believe this is more than just a gathering, Ms. Madison. It is an opportunity for truth, perhaps even for resolution. And Witherhold, I am certain, will be waiting. Yours in truth and admiration, Egan Kirst, CEO, Carousel Corporation, host of Witherhold Manor. A dinner party, that explained why I was wearing the dress. My history with that location explained why I had shorts underneath and flats that were good for running, second only to actual athletic shoes. The werewolf thing explained why I found a silver letter opener tied to my inner thigh. I was prepared for things to go bad. After I'd searched the car for any other clues, I began driving toward Carousel, not knowing exactly where my character's story was leading. I was filled with a lot of nervous excitement that did not belong to me. And a little that did. I arrived in town 5 hours before the dinner party was to start. That meant one thing: it was time to start talking to people. That was what I brought to the table. And one could fight, Riley could see tropes and come up with plans, and I could be the center of attention. I could let the audience get to know me, maybe even like me, as much as I resented needing that. So, that's what I set about doing. Just talking to people. I parked my car at a small motel and wandered from place to place, looking for NPCs who might engage with me. It was nerve-wracking. In some ways, it was scarier than walking alone in the woods, knowing a monster could be lurking. But the fear here was different. As I looked through the crowds of hikers, swimmers, and fishermen, I worried I would miss something or not do well enough. I was always afraid to let the others down. That fear started to rear its ugly head as I failed, time after time, to get anyone to talk to me in a meaningful way, not like the officer had, with his flood of information. They spoke, sure, but in short, unremarkable ways, never letting the conversation unfold. That was the telltale sign. When people just kept talking, as long as you kept pulling the thread, you knew you were onto something. After 2 hours of chatting with cashiers and drunk teenagers heading for the river, I felt like I was failing entirely. I hadn't even been on screen for more than a few seconds at a time. What was I doing wrong? I tried to think it through. The plot cycle was still at the very beginning of the party phase, so it wasn't too late, but I needed to get a move on. I needed to figure out why Carousel had dropped me here. As I pondered this, walking on a thin, worn sidewalk along the road, a woman with a flattering pixie cut waved to me. She was just an ordinary NPC, a waitress, in fact, and she waved me over to take a seat at a small diner with outdoor benches and picnic tables. I was so eager for an interaction that I practically ran over, and as soon as I sat down, I was on screen. That meant I hadn't screwed up yet. "What'll you have?" she asked as if she hadn't just waved me over and was a little annoyed to see me. "Just some French fries," I said. The formerly friendly waitress gave me a look of disdain like she hated her job. She rolled her eyes and said, "It'll be just a minute." As strange as it was, I liked those moments when I caught a glimpse of what might be the real person, watching her put on this facade of annoyance. But that was the last time I would speak to her. I had no real scene here. Why was I brought to this place? Was I supposed to have said something else? I looked around, hoping to make eye contact with someone. From my spot on the bench, I could see across the street to the motel parking lot where my convertible sat. A cluster of teenagers hung around, but none were messing with my car. Beyond the motel was a trailhead leading down into the woods and eventually to the river. I'd seen it while wandering around, looking for interactions. And then, I saw what I'd been meant to find. I saw a dead woman. Knowing immediately what I needed to do, I stood up from the bench, squinting to get a better look. Beyond the motel was a group of hikers with beach towels draped over their shoulders, and beyond them was a trio who looked like they'd just come from a grungy music festival. In the center of them was a woman with long black hair, red lips, red as blood, and bare feet. She walked with a sure, confident stride. "Sarah!" I screamed. This was my character's friend from the article I'd found in my car, one of the friends who was supposed to be dead. I screamed her name again, louder, and this time she looked at me. Our eyes met, and we just stared at each other on screen. Social awareness told me she remembered me. It told me she had strong feelings, but I couldn't tell what they were. She looked like an ordinary NPC, but according to social awareness, her moxie level was 7, which was strong enough to resist my insight drop a bit. She was hiding something, but I couldn't say what. Lots of NPCs had higher moxie than their plot armor would suggest. Carousel used them to manipulate players without them knowing. NPCs had a trap that hid their moxie and didn't apply it to their effective plot armor. It didn't ever come up unless you were interacting with them in a very specific way, a way related to their purpose in the story. I started moving toward her. "Ma'am, your French fries," the waitress called after me, having conveniently delivered them just as I spotted my supposedly dead friend. But I ignored her. I called Sarah's name again. As I ran to cross the street, a car suddenly honked, tires squealing on the pavement. I swore I'd been watching where I was going, yet this car had come out of nowhere, trapping me on my side of the road just long enough for Sarah and the two men with her to vanish without a trace. When the car passed, I looked around, panicking, trying to evoke the emotions my character must be feeling. "Sarah!" I called out one last time, but she was gone. And the scene was over. And the story was just beginning. Advertisement Chapter 72 Riley Tilda. I was getting all kinds of footage as we walked back up through the basement path that would lead us into Witherhold Manor. The dailies triggered around the time the werewolves started transforming. I thought I would zoom through the footage and give the group the highlights. There are so many hikers, campers, and people staying at cabins along the river, I said. Carousel's been taking footage of them all day, but I think some of them are werewolves. I don't know which ones, though. I can see the way it focuses the camera on some of them, but I'm not sure exactly what the language of film is trying to convey here. Are all of these people werewolves? I was talking to myself out loud at that point, but the others were listening closely. What exactly are you seeing? Ant-Man asked. Just nature photography mostly, I replied. But whenever I see a group of people, sometimes the camera will look at them from a certain angle that in movies means they're evil, exaggerating the size of their head, the sharpness of their features, catching them in shadows. That's how you know someone's bad before you know they're bad. It could be hard to explain, but you knew it when you saw it. So you're saying we may be surrounded by hundreds of werewolves? We're going to get our butts kicked? Ant-Man asked. Or chewed, I said. I'm not getting as much footage as I'd like, which should theoretically mean that we have a high-savvy enemy. But that doesn't sound right at all. Unless curse savvy is what I'm fighting against, which is a can of worms itself. Maybe one of the werewolf tropes was interfering with the dailies. I didn't know. Are you getting locations with this data? Andrew asked. He wanted all the facts as much as I did. More facts meant better planning. Even though he was high savvy, his tropes were mostly centered around healing, and he wasn't great at finding out information unless he was cutting open a dead body. Vaguely, I said. They are all situated along the river, and there have been a lot of shots following the river all the way up toward the property the manor is on. Wait a second. What is it? Ant-Man asked. Flashes of carnage flickered in my mind. Was there an attack recently? No. That wasn't it. I got footage of the werewolves mauling Logan and Avery, I said. It's cut up and pasted together, but I think it's actual footage. They are using the footage of when we trespassed onto the monster lair? Andrew asked. That's my best guess, I said. From the way they shot it, it almost felt like they didn't know how it was going to be used in the final film. I, for one, Kimberly said, am glad not to have footage of someone being mauled in my head. As we made our way up into the manor from the basement, we were greeted by Curse Butler, who insisted on leading us outside. Wait, you're not putting us outside when we know there are werewolves around, are you? Kimberly asked the butler. I don't think you have anything to fear here, my darling, he said in reply. I didn't know this guy's story, but he had way too much personality for a random NPC. He continued leading us out of the manor and back onto the property where I could see some type of... Well, it wasn't exactly a castle, but there were lots of stone structures and walls. On screen. What is that? Kimberly asked. She was always ready for a scene. That, my dear, is the palisade, the fort. Or at least, it was once. Palisades were made of vertical sticks stuck in the ground. This was not. I'd have to let that slide. What I saw in front of me was a network of tall stone walls, many of them crumbling but still upright and imposing. That's a death trap, Ant-Man said. A werewolf could clear those walls without even thinking about it. The butler smiled his devious little smile and said, I think we're counting on that. You're planning a trap? Andrew asked. Werewolves are mindless creatures, the butler said. Many of the resources we've found confirmed that. What resources were they looking at? That's a bad bet, Hawk said. He was mostly quiet. He was one of those men that you could just see the intelligence in his eyes. He understood what we were talking about off-screen, whether he spoke about it or not. Oh, the butler asked. Then, I suppose you will have no difficulty imparting your wisdom to the captain. Imparting wisdom is always the hard part, Hawk said. The werewolves around Carousel are not stupid like many of the wolves in other parts of the world. Here, they are as smart as you are, once they mature a bit. That hung in the air for a beat. Perhaps you can design, the butler said, pausing as the sound of a wolf could be heard in the distance, a better trap than. Go straight onto the palisade wall. There's an entrance. You'll be able to see it when you get closer. I should not have to tell you that curse may know you have been infected, and each one of them is ready to take your head off if you cause problems. I really hoped that wasn't a source of drama in this story. That would be lame. If the legends are true, I said, I imagine we won't be the only infected ones soon enough. Something tells me you picked a really bad week to try to antagonize the wolves. I wanted to come back at him in equal force while being vague. What are you, some sort of psychic now? I didn't remember reading that in your dossier, the butler said. No, I said, that's my grandmother, that's the psychic. Me? I just have gut instinct. Lots of would-be hunters think it's a werewolf's ferocity that kills, but that's not it. It's their playfulness. I wanted to set this movie up as a battle of the wits, not just a fight to the death. We could win the savvy and hustle fight. The werewolves had the advantage in direct combat. For the first time, the butler seemed to have been tripped up by something one of us said. And one leaned over to the butler and said, they are thrill-seekers, werewolves, and my money says they already know we're here. In fact, my money says they've already walked amongst us, watching us. I hope you kept track of the meatheads. He must have understood where I was going. The butler didn't have much to say to that. He just did a strange little bow, turned tail, and walked back toward the manor. Off-screen. Before we got to the palisade, Kimberly decided to tell us about her backstory. She told us about a woman who was her friend and former camp counselor who had somehow survived the attack that Kimberly thought had killed her. If she is alive, that means she was turned, Michael said. He didn't make a peep on screen. I agreed with him. You'll have to play that up, I said. Really focus on that relationship. Should take up screen time and make a good subplot. Kimberly nodded. She didn't have a lot of information on the woman, Sarah, so she was probably going to have to make things up, but that was okay. Sarah would go along with pretty much anything Kimberly said and would probably even add to it. Usually. Once we found the entrance to the fort, hidden in the stone and not easily visible from afar, we followed a path of overgrown grass and dead leaves that had recently been trampled on. Inside the fort, a large courtyard was transformed into a battle station. 24 armed mercenaries, many firearms, and explosives were set up. In the corner, a blacksmith appeared to be creating silver bullets en masse. Cannon fodder, Michael said, looking over the men. Dead meat, I agreed. Lila's not here, Andrew said. I haven't seen a trace of her yet. It's always difficult with her being a wallflower and all. Did you see her while watching the dailies? He asked me. I shook my head. She might have been there, but there were so many different people I didn't notice her. She might not have ever appeared on screen yet. I remembered she was good at that. It's a pity, Andrew said. Andrew, like Cassie, had the ability to detect the health status of all of his teammates from anywhere, but he had to actually interact in some way with them in the story first. Even a mention from someone who had talked to them might be enough. He hadn't done that yet with Lila. Was he afraid that she had run away or that she was up to something? I didn't know, but I could tell that some of us were thinking it. All right, Ant-Man said. Spread out. See if you can get any information. I need to find this captain person and have a talk. Get a lay of the land as best you can. Just do some exploring, Hawk said, speaking for the first time off-screen. I doubt the wolves are going to come out tonight. It's too overcast, they get lethargic without the moon, even with this pitiful little sliver shining through. He was looking up at the sky, and while the moon was not visible, there was a glow through the clouds, just enough to tell where the moon was, but not enough to make it out completely. So Hawk could speak to us, just not out of character. Kimberly I spent a while looking around the fort. I wanted to know the exits, the people, the vibe. I wanted to know where we would be sleeping and if I could find a change of clothes. I wanted to think about the story. Egan Kirst was a perfectly charming and polite sociopath, and yet, when I saw the way he looked at his son, I could see he was truly vulnerable. Riley and Antoine didn't trust him, they thought he was going to backstab us again, but I thought he was telling the truth, not just in the way an NPC is when following a script. I believed that the real man beneath it all felt something intensely during that scene, and that might have been the only true thing he said to us, that he loved his son. That didn't make sense because his son was being played by someone else, but I knew in my heart that Egan Curse did love someone. I would bet money that he lost them, too. He was using his pain for his performance. I knew a thing or two about that. I heard someone yelling in the distance and snapped out of my thoughts. Now, men, listen up. This here is Antoine Stone. He's a third-generation werewolf killer, and he seems to think he knows something we don't. And as I don't want to be werewolf shit in the morning, I say we give him a listen. The man talking was older than the rest. He had kind eyes for a mercenary. His name was Captain Neil Tiber. He was a grizzled military type. Riley had called him a direct stereotype when we first saw him, and I suppose he was, but I thought he had a sense of humor. Antoine stood next to the captain in front of 26 mercenaries, most of whom were at least as tall as Antoine and twice as muscular. "We have a bit of an emergency here," Antoine said. "I've been looking around at your firearms, and you've got them all wrong." Antoine wasn't afraid to butt heads. "Wolf comes to me, I'll blow his head off," one of the men said with an accent I couldn't place. That got chuckles out of the rest of the men. I stood in the back and watched. All I had managed to accomplish was finding a change of clothes so that I didn't have to wear a dress everywhere I went. I also picked up a gun. They were everywhere. "That's the exact problem," Antoine said. "Most of the firearms I see around here are too strong." The laughter didn't stop. It just changed from mocking to curious. "The goal is to put the silver bullet into the wolf, not to shoot through it. The silver has to stay in the body until morning light," Antoine said. "If your shot is a through and through, that wolf gets right back up 30 minutes later. I recommend handguns for close combat and silver bird shot to keep them sweet. Shoot once to kill, shoot again to make sure they stay dead." The men weren't laughing anymore. "They'll get right back up if I shoot them in the head?" the first soldier asked again. Antoine started to answer, but then Hawk took over. "They can survive anything, assuming the silver slug doesn't stay in their corpse. Headshot? They'll get up eventually. Shot to the heart takes a little longer. But worse than that, they are gonna play dead and make you think you got 'em. And if you did get 'em, one of their friends, one of the more mature ones, the self-aware ones, they'll come over and dig that silver out. We are up against an enemy that knows its weaknesses. This isn't a big game hunt. This is a war." The men were silent and confused. "How are we supposed to know these things are dead if what you say is true?" the captain asked. "Shoot 'em dead, then shoot 'em with silver bird shot like the young gun said. That'll work. What I like to do is plant this sucker in their heart, make sure they stay down till morning," Hawk said, producing a large hunting knife made entirely of silver. From there on, I half listened to the conversation between the soldiers, Antoine, and Hawk. Something else had caught my attention, a blacksmith. She was a woman, easily in her 60s, wearing a mask to save herself from the silver fumes. On the red wallpaper, her name was Hetty Morgan. I'm not sure what drew me to her. Maybe it was the calluses on her fingers I noticed when she took off one of her big blacksmith gloves, or the way she kept glancing up at Antoine as if she wasn't surprised at all at the things she was hearing, unlike the soldiers. I approached her, but before I could ask her anything, she walked to the back of her little forge setup and tinkered with something I couldn't see. I thought it was just a piece of wood. Soon, I understood what was happening. Antoine and the others were on screen, and this interaction I was about to have needed to be on screen. And yet, Carousel stuck to its rule that only one thing was on screen at a time. Sure enough, when Antoine went off screen and the soldiers disbanded, the silversmith gracefully walked back over to her workbench and began gathering little bits of silver into a thick cup made of something that could be put into the furnace. A crucible, I thought it was called. On screen. "Do you think we have a chance?" I asked, trying to play it cool, like I knew would have. I looked over the weapons she was making with extreme interest. The woman looked up at me, wiped the sweat off her brow, and said, "This is a foolish thing to do." "Mr. Curse is desperate," I said. "Most fools are, eventually," she answered as she picked the cup up and moved it over into the furnace. "Still, We have to try. Do we have to try? Hetty asked. I say you either kill a wolf or you set it free. The wolves around Carousel are peaceful, for wolves. They only kill once in a blue moon, and I'm old enough to remember it could be much worse. Wolves without a pack ain't much better than wild things. This thing we're doing, even if we succeed, a lot of people in Carousel are going to die for it. She had clearly been thinking about this for a while. She sounded angry. But why help if she thought it was a bad idea? Killing the pack leader, I said. Do you think that's a mistake? She was quick to answer. I do, Hetty said. You kill her, and all these wolves won't be no better than any of the others. She keeps them in line. She? I asked. The pack leader is a female, a woman? Hetty laughed. A she-wolf, she said. You don't think a man could do that job, do you? Always been a woman since before I was a child. Since my mother herself was a child, the she-wolf roamed these hills and gathered her pack, and there was peace. But the wolves ain't always so peaceful, and when she ain't around to stop it, some of her little boys go a bit crazy. They go killing just to kill, just to eat. And she doesn't have them do that? I asked. Not her, Hetty said. You can hear it in her howl. She's the most Levesic wolf you ever heard. She's looking for love, not blood, but she ain't found it yet. I listened as close as I could and I let those words affect me for a moment. I was attacked not far from here. My friends were killed, I said after a few seconds. I finally got the courage to come back here. Hetty turned and finally looked me in the eye. I know who you are, girlie, she said. And you should never have come back here. Chills went down my spine as the wind picked right when she said that. Why? I asked. The wolves never forget a scent, she said. I cleared my throat. You seem to know a lot about this, I said. I only know what I've been told. What can you tell me about the manor house? How does it fit into the legend? I asked. Well, everything's got to start somewhere, she said. Everything's gotta end somewhere too. You're saying the werewolf curse actually did start here, just like they're saying? I asked. Hetty pulled the crucible from the fire and poured the silver down into a metal box where it would form into bullets. You'll have to ask the she-wolf about that. She was here when it happened. She's been looking for love ever since. I didn't know where this was going, but it sounded important. My colleague Riley Lawrence over there says that all werewolves are in love. He had seen in on footage in his head. Oh, yes, the woman said with a cackle. Ever since the first. She grabbed the newly formed batch of bullets and hauled them to a different part of her tent. She was done talking. Off-screen. We continued exploring, and while we didn't find a whole lot inside the palisade walls, we did get a good understanding of their layout in case we were suicidal enough to actually have a fight out under the stars. We were given sleeping quarters in a chamber underneath the palisade, and the first night drifted away peacefully. First blood was still long enough away that we could feel safe. All werewolves were in love, I thought to myself as I lay on my cot. I looked across the room to her and one was sleeping. Everything was so much better when you were in love. Even a place like Carousel couldn't break you if you could be with someone who cared about you above all else. So, Carousel told stories about love, huh? Did that mean love still had power here? I hoped so. I drifted off to sleep, only waking once to what I thought was the sound of a wolf howling, but it was just the wind. Chapter 73. And when Tilda as I looked over the group of mercenaries, all eyes trained on me, I was hit with memories from my basketball days. That era was so long ago. Damn. I guess it really just hit me again. I was a retired basketball player. I'd been itching to quit for years, but when the time finally came, it wasn't on my terms, and somehow, I hardly even noticed. Anyway, these mercenaries, they were like my old teammates back then. There's nothing like having a team, the common goal, the camaraderie, the clarity of purpose. That's what sports had been for me. My teammates were a kind of family. Back when my actual family was not. And somehow, I'd found something close in this group of men, all of us and way over our heads. I could sense their camaraderie, feel their hands reaching out to me, inviting me into their strange, reckless chapter. They wanted me to be one of them, a fighter. Hell, that's what everyone seemed to want me to be. When are we gonna go out there and skin some pups? One of the men called out, sparking a round of cheers from the others. He had long blonde hair tied up in a bun, deep blue eyes that almost pierced through you, and even a scar over his eyebrow. But I knew he wasn't anyone important. He didn't even have a name on the red wallpaper. He was a mercenary, and that was all there was to him, a mercenary who hoots and hollers and gets everyone riled up. But wasn't that what I was, too? I surveyed the group. A lot of them were buzzing with rage, itching to kill something, but that didn't sit right with me. Rage wasn't what they needed. It didn't make sense here. They didn't have anything to be angry at. Maybe they just wanted blood, or, more likely, they were scared. But why didn't they run? They didn't have to be here. I knew what Riley would say, that they were scripted to be here. But I was thinking about them as people, as men. Why would they stay when everything we'd told them had been nothing but bad news? They weren't going to massacre the werewolves. It wasn't going to be some killing spree, and they sure as hell weren't going to skin any pups. All I could figure was that they were afraid. And with practice, you can turn fear into anger, and anger can make you feel so damn powerful. But anger fueled by fear, that's a dangerous thing, something you can't control. Because when the killers come, the anger fades, and the fear comes back twice as strong. I knew that. I'd been in Carousel long enough. I'd looked for power within myself so many times, the power to keep going, to just survive a little longer, and anger didn't cut it. Not for long. Sometimes, you run out of power, and you don't die. That's the worst thing that can happen. I knew that better than anyone. Even as I stood there, my brain tried to remind me it was broken. Calm. I had to stay calm, project strength, and be a leader. I took a deep breath. I looked at the men again. There are no mercenaries in the forest, I thought to myself. I further surveyed the courtyard. There are no stone walls in the forest. There are no campfires in the forest. I must not be in the forest, then. Surely. It's true what they say, you can take a man out of the straggler forest, but you can't take a man out of the straggler forest. Our first line of business, I said, is to find out where their hideout is. We have to make a full frontal attack during daylight hours when only the mature wolves will be able to shift. They looked at me, waiting for me to say the right thing. They didn't want a plan, they wanted reassurance, wanted me to fan the flames inside them, make them feel invincible. Then we're gonna go skin some pups, I yelled. The applause was thunderous, the cheering, the screaming. When I'd first met these mercenaries, they were skeptical of me. I hadn't had enough moxie to keep them under control effortlessly. I had to win them over with actual words. I had to play the scene right because, whether Riley knew it or not, we weren't in a horror movie anymore, we were in a sports movie. And an inspirational speech had power in those. I'd watched enough of them in the locker room before games. Our team had to win. The other team had to lose. And maybe, if I played this right, I'd get the big kiss from the leading lady. I looked across the courtyard to where Kimberly was talking to the blacksmith, an older woman whom I could now see was probably a much more important character than most of these mercenaries. Kimberly sure knew how to pick a lead. She took a bit to get the hang of this game, but when she set her heart to it, she thrived. Kimberly was not in the forest. So neither was I. Now, it's my understanding that you've been doing recon here for the last week or so. I need you to get me up to speed. It's been a while since I've hunted in these parts, I said. Most of the mercenaries dispersed as I was led to a large table with a map of Carousel's parks spread across it. Michael was already there. He didn't need a map, and it almost seemed like he didn't like us looking at one like that, which might make him obsolete. He really wanted to help save his friends. I understood. I had friends, and a brother, to save too. The map didn't make much sense from what I knew of Carousel's terrain and layout, but that was why we were here on a sound stage, wasn't it? Captain Neil Tiber seemed different from the others. He didn't need me to play cheerleader or convince him we were bound for success. He seemed to understand the odds weren't in our favor, yet he never suggested we back down. That might have been because of the script, though. He was too smart to go along with this. We spent the last week checking most of the cave systems to the south, the captain said. Didn't find any evidence of squatting. It's my understanding that werewolves don't like to live in the wilderness. They tend to have hideaways that are more comfortable for their human forms. He looked up at me, expecting a response. That's right, I said. You're looking for abandoned buildings, places really out of the way. That's a tough one, the captain said. We've scoured the area. There were some factories near the quarry, but no signs of life there, beast or otherwise. The only area we haven't checked is this section, but that's because there are so many campers there. And since we've gotten here, the numbers have nearly doubled, he said, frowning. As we spoke, Kimberly walked over, close enough to see where the captain's finger was pointing. The summer camp, she said. Is it still standing? That's an awful good question, miss. In fact, it's the next place we need to check, the captain said. I'm going, Kimberly said. I'll go with you. Her character had survived a massacre at that summer camp, so it made sense she'd feel drawn to that place. Storyline exploration was almost intuitive. You just followed hunches, looked for clues, and kept looking until something fit. And, usually, you found something. Kimberly had to go, and so did I, but I knew I couldn't just let her jump in without a second thought. I gently took her hand and moved her a few steps from the map. I leaned in close and asked, "Are you sure? We can check it out ourselves, you know. You don't have to go back. I'm confident you can handle it. It's just, you might have some bad memories there you don't need to stir up." "I do," she said, "but I didn't come here to run from my past. For so many years, I was confused about what happened, my memories all mixed up in a blur. I need to remember." "Is it about your friend, the one you saw in town?" I asked. "That's part of it," she said, "but it's not just that. I need answers. Why did I survive, Ant 1? Do you remember that night? I remember I barricaded myself in one of the cabins, but I don't know why they didn't break in. They had plenty of time before you got there. I just don't understand." I had no answers for her. I nodded, touching her arm gently in reassurance. We walked back over to the table, where the captain was talking to Michael, who, thanks to his tropes, knew the landmarks better than anyone. He knew every trail, where the blueberry and salmonberry bushes grew, where the springs and even old tree houses were located. "Do werewolves eat berries?" the captain asked suddenly, confused at why Michael had brought it up. Michael stopped, stumped. His tropes didn't supply him an answer for that. He was just showing off. "Humans do," I said, "and they need to eat, too, when they're not wolves." I tried to smooth over the awkward pause, aware we were on screen. We all looked down at the map, at the little icon shaped like a cabin, with the words Carousel River Camp printed neatly next to it. "Time to go camping," I said. Tilda Riley told it was never too late to learn something new in Carousel. One thing I was looking forward to in the storyline was the concept of sanctuary. It was something a trop could do, where you'd be given a location that would be guaranteed to be safe for a certain amount of time based on one of your stats. I had done a lot of reading about it after discovering that the speakeasy was associated with a trop. The speakeasy gave sanctuary based on the player's hustle stat. In the Atlas, the first thing you learn about sanctuary is to never trust it. It wasn't fully understood. While it would last longer depending on whichever stat controlled it, it would sometimes just kind of disappear if you accidentally derailed whatever subplot was taking place inside it. Andrew had not one but two tropes that provided sanctuary. His first protected him while he was healing someone and only lasted long enough to do that. That sounded fair, he said it was pretty reliable. His second was called Study Session, and it ensured there would be a miniature library in a storyline. This library would contain lots of information, some of it useful, that the user and allies could use for research purposes. Better yet, that trop said the sanctuary would last all of Rebirth. However, Andrew claimed that there was more to it than that. Sometimes it protects long before rebirth, and often it cuts out right in the middle. I haven't quite figured it out yet. It's a newer trap. I didn't like the idea of a trap I didn't understand, but I was fascinated by the idea. We were off-screen as we searched through the manor for the stacks, which was the name of his miniature library granted by his trop. "Are you sure it's going to be in the manor?" I asked. Andrew nodded. "Yes." I spoke with Kirst, and he assured me that he had collected together all of the written works that were in the house, and many of those that had been stolen and sold, and he put them inside the study. He didn't tell her where the study was, though. "Evidently not," Andrew said. Reading in the atlas, I felt like I could understand the idea of a sanctuary, kind of. For instance, with the stacks, you had to continue your search for answers. Once you were finished, or if you gave up, the protection would disappear. That made sense. As for why the trap might protect you before rebirth despite saying it didn't, I couldn't say. Perhaps in some storylines, there was simply a logistical issue, that if someone was killed in the stacks in First Blood, they might not be available during rebirth, so Carousel might extend protection so that no one gets killed there before rebirth. But that was all guesswork. We turned a corner on the top floor of the manor, and suddenly we found ourselves bathed in candlelight. It was early morning, but the windows in the house had been shuttered, so it was pretty dark inside, and we were relying on lanterns. Once we got to the west wing of the top floor, or the top floor of the west wing, as it was supposed to be, we saw sconces with candles on them leading to a room at the end of the hall, a room whose doorway was hidden behind a bookcase left ajar. Inside, we saw Egan Kirst, for the first time since he had left us last night, reading his way through a large volume that looked to be hundreds of years old. On screen, Kirst didn't get up and didn't acknowledge us. We entered the stacks and gazed upon. Well, the stacks and stacks of books, some of which were decades old, others hundreds of years old. Once we were done gazing in amazement, Kirst finally spoke up. "I suspect that if this room were not hidden, we would not have the benefit of this bounty. Thieves plundered this place for over 100 years. I suspect it right along with you," I said. He got up from his old leather chair, which barely fit into the room, which was not very wide due to the stacks of books. "I expect that you'll be able to learn whatever you might need from this collection," he said. "Remember, the pack leader must be dead, so study as you must, but don't think I'll pay you if you stay tucked into this room for your entire stay." He had a smile on his face. He must have seen how excited we were around these old books. And I was excited. I didn't have to pretend. I knew there were solutions to our problems in these books. It wasn't like in normal storylines I'd been in, where you might have been wasting your time if you didn't have a scholar there to confirm it for you. I knew there were answers here. I just didn't know which book held them. Luckily, Andrew and I both had high savvy stats, which would theoretically help us find what we were looking for, though it was difficult to imagine how that would work. Savvy wasn't actual intelligence. After all, it was intelligence that showed up on screen. And as far as the screen was concerned, picking up the right book at the right time was being intelligent. So what we had to do was start picking up books. The first volume I picked up was called Andron's Book of Safs, which I thought might be useful if it had something for werewolf bites or similar, but I had no such luck. It did, however, have a really cool first line that I found as I sat myself down in a chair I had brought from downstairs and looked through it. "If you're reading this book, it's already too late," it read. That was the first line worthy of a better book. With no savs related to werewolves, I put the book in an area we had designated for our duds and moved on to the next one. As we went along, most of the books were duds, and thank goodness most were obvious duds. We didn't have to waste too much time on any one book, with few exceptions. We were on and off screen for the entire time. It was strange to think that somewhere in these stacks was, tucked away, a book that could completely tilt the advantage in our direction. But which one? I looked through the stacks. Lots of old legal texts, you could always tell from the binding. I was looking for something different, something old but not too old. If it was too old, I wouldn't be able to read it. My eyes rested on a leather-bound tome buried near the bottom of a large stack. Something felt special about it, but I couldn't quite tell what. Perhaps it was that half the book had been damaged by water, giving it an almost ghost-like quality, like I was staring at a half-dead book. At that point, I had been through so many that I was due for a winner. Andrea had already found a textbook that claimed to be on metahuman anatomy, although calling it a textbook was generous. It was very old, and the sketches were not particularly well done. I opened the book and soon found that what was before me was the journal of a man who used the pseudonym Amadeus Singh. The date in the first entry of the book was June 11, 1825, and boy, did the handwriting match. It was a real struggle to get through, but it also had a really good first line. I write at the behest of monsters. Well, alright, you have my attention, I thought. Tobe continued. Thanks for listening.